Welcome to the Literati scene with Smokey Bacon and Dick Concannon, and co-hosts Suzanne McDonald and Joanna DiTillo. So stay tuned.
Our guest today is writer, professor, etc., Michael Rockland, who has written a memoir which involves Spain under Franco, a diplomat's life. Tell us, in my time, we always thought of Spain in terms of Hemingway and Pamplona, and the Franco War was all American volunteers and that sort of thing. But tell us about the period you were there and were doing your duties.
Sure. Well, I guess I was missing the 60s. Instead, I was in Spain living in a fascist dictatorship. Luckily, I was a cultural attaché, and so I got to hang out with the artists and the writers and the intellectuals. And in fact, my main job was liaison with the Spanish universities and in really fomenting democratic ideas and causes, probably more than anything else. So I got to do the fun, good part, while the U.S. was officially cozy enough with the Franco dictatorship because of the Cold War.
Yeah.
And we had these two SAC air bases plus a nuclear submarine base. And so the embassy officially was in a sense with the bad guys. But I had the good fortune of mostly being outside of the embassy and trying to hang out with the good guys.
Well, of course, you, in your work, certainly had a terrible problem when we had a plane go down with nuclear bombs on it.
Yeah.
That has to be one of the greatest PR works that we have ever dealt with.
Yes, and it was a disaster. A B-52. We used to send, and of course we in the embassy knew nothing about this. I certainly didn't know it in cultural work. We would send squadrons of B-52s towards the Soviet border, which would fly around in what was actually called the fail-safe position. I'd read the novel and seen the movie Fail-Safe. And suddenly I found myself immersed in I don't know if it was Fail-Safe or Dr. Strangelove, but it was pretty strange. A B-52 on its way back from the Soviet border, because we'd send, apparently what I learned later is we would send squadrons every 6 hours out of the eastern United States towards the Soviet border. They would refuel on the way over on the coast of Spain and refuel on the way back with KC-135 tankers. Well, this time they collided and most of the airmen were killed. But now you had these 4 hydrogen bombs coming down by parachute, and each of which was 75 times more powerful than Hiroshima or Nagasaki, so we're dealing with 300 times more powerful. Had these been armed, they were not armed. We all remember this airman who used to walk around with the president with a little black bag, where the codes were kept, and the codes changed every day. All of this I learned later. I was basically selling Mark Twain and jazz. But it certainly impeded my work once these bombs had come down, because if you're trying to convince people in a foreign country as a cultural attaché that we're pretty nice people and we've got a nice culture and they ought to read us and pay attention to us, And now you've got 4 hydrogen bombs coming down on Spain, unarmed. That is, apparently arming was only supposed to be under the direct order of the president, and the codes changed every day. 2 airmen had to do it together, and that they only would have done had they been ordered while they were flying in circles around near the Soviet border. Basically, we were saying to the Russians, we can have a bomber with hydrogen bombs in Moscow in 1 hour, so don't mess with us. What they were doing, I suspect they were doing similar things with us, but I don't know what they were. I think they were submarines with nuclear devices aboard them. Somebody told me that.
Well, Spain, basically, I think their greatest export has been their language.
Yeah.
But tell us today, other than finances, which we seem to be on the edge, but we're
Yes,
part of.
very much so.
Tell us, what is the Spanish relations, basically, you know, through the UN and our dealings with them today?
Yes, well, I think our feelings today and our relations with them are very good. Democracy to democracy. Personally, I wish they had not sent a few troops to Iraq, and that ended up bringing down the previous government of Spain. But they are a democracy, and the wonderful thing for me is that though I was there with the embassy for 4 years, a long time ago, I never really left. I go to Spain about once a year. In fact, I'll be going this coming March, and I lecture in Spain. My Spanish is just about as good as my English, which is a real thrill to be able to really have a language. And the current book came out last year with the University of Valencia Press first, and now it's coming out here. So this is a great richness in my life, having this whole Spanish connection, both to culture and to.
Well, if people have further questions for you, do you have a website?
Yes, it's michaelrockland.com, and there are listed all my 13 books. This is just my latest, and I'd love for people to visit. I'd love for people to email me. The email is on the website. Pictures of all the books are on the website. And I thought I would be one of those people who would never have a website, but I did, so, and it's proven to be a nice thing.
Well, I want to thank you for being on the show.
Thank you.
Good luck to you and your next trip to Spain.
Thanks very, very much.
Our guest today is Steve Pinkham, a writer who has put together his latest book, Tale of the Old Maine Woods. Tell us, Steve, you have picked a period that was still quite primitive, even though we all think we're very sophisticated. During the early turn of the century period, why did you pick this period?
I chose this period because largely that's when the early sporting magazines began. They began in 1871 with American Sportsman, and Forest and Stream was 2 years later, and it ballooned from there with many sporting articles coming out through newspapers and with that. Largely because before the Civil War, there was very few people going to Maine. People didn't have vacations. The trains hadn't gotten into the woods yet. But after the Civil War, there was a huge explosion of people going into the woods on vacations, and easier to get there.
Well, was it the railroads that made the inroads there to set up the hotels and all the rest that brought your people that you deal with all were pretty solid people in the sense that they enjoyed trout fishing and hunting and so forth. Tell us about that period.
In that period, there were a lot of prominent men from Boston, New York, Philadelphia. They would get on the train and go to Maine, but they would have to go like 2 weeks to a month at a time, and they would stay, and so the plan was to be there for a long time. The hotels actually would begin in the towns, but as the railroad got further north, the hotels would show up on lakes and other places. And as they got further into the woods, sporting camps developed. And they couldn't build them fast enough as they got out there because more and more people started jumping on the train and going to Maine. They were going to Maine, they were going to the Adirondacks as well, which these two places vied against each other for being the best fishing places.
Well, you know, in several of the articles that I read in there, these people would stop off at lumberjack camps.
They occasionally would. No one intended to go to a camp, although that is always a question for people, but you wouldn't want to go to a camp. You would stop there and you could get a meal, but that meal would be basically pork and beans. That was their staple. And you could stay if you wanted to. If you wanted to sleep with 40 men in a cabin where they had not changed their clothes for 3 months, not taken a bath, had a steady diet of beans, and all had lice.
Tell us, you have researched an enormous number of articles. Tell us how that was brought on.
My first book was about the mountains of Maine from down east. And I wrote about the mountains, but I kept finding these wonderful stories. So like I said before, I went back to those first sporting magazines. At this point, I have gathered over 23,000 articles on the Maine woods, and I have 150 books on the Maine woods. I have maps, pamphlets, magazines. I have a phenomenal collection that I can draw from, and I've put it all on spreadsheets so I can find the information.
Oh, that's very important. And tell us, you have more than enough material to come out with a sequel. Do you plan on that?
Yes. When my publisher and I looked at what I had put together for this book, we decided we could very easily split it in two because there is a limit to how big you can make a book in the publishing world. And it worked perfectly, so I divided them evenly. There are hunting articles, fishing articles, of course, but there's many animal encounters. There are tall tales and funny stories, and even a couple ghost stories.
Well, let me say, if you have a feeling for the outdoors, this is a book that covers a period of time, especially in this northeastern area that goes from basically the Indians right up to, we haven't gotten to the modern day yet, but we may in the next book. This is extremely interesting. Tell us, if our people who view this wish to discuss more, do you have a website?
I do. And the website is oldtalesofthemainewoods.com. It's the name of the book, oldtalesofthemainewoods.com. And on my website, you can email me, be right there. The email is steve@oldtalesofthemainewoods.com. And you'll be able to read some background about each region on that website, and find out about the book. If you click on the buy the book, there'll be a cover of the book. You click on that, and you can strum through some pages.
Oh, that's great.
And see the inside of the book.
Well, good luck to you in your next book, and thank you for being on the show.
Okay.
now and then in the field of psychology, somebody breaks through, and one thinks that there's nothing new to break through to. Well, our guest today is here to prove it wrong. There is. And her name is Jonice Webb. And her book is Running on Empty. A very interesting thing. It is called Childhood Emotional, and I want to say distress. It's not. It's neglect. And interestingly enough, this is a silent sickness that one doesn't know one has, and one doesn't know when it's occurring in various results. But Jonice is going to tell us about it, how you came to this silent affliction, so to speak. How does one discover something that's not there?
It was tough.
If you tell
well, I've been a psychologist for over 20 years, and during that time, I kept seeing in my office over and over again the same pattern, which was adults who were telling me that their life was fine, their current life was fine, their childhood was fine, and yet they found themselves struggling with feeling kind of disconnected and unfulfilled and alone. And maybe their spouses were complaining that they weren't emotionally connected enough in the marriage. And they couldn't explain it because everything was fine. And once I saw enough of it, I started to realize that we were looking in the wrong place for the explanation for it, that it's not due to something that happened to the person in childhood. It's due to something that failed to happen for the person in childhood. So maybe I should explain what.
Well, the thing is, I think that, in fact, you mentioned 6 things that happen that you can overcome in your book. I want to get to the pragmatic side of your book, because you have advice for medical professionals, what have you. But you do mention this, the things that will result as this sickness, if you would let our viewers know what they are.
Some examples are, let's say, well, I'll give you the definition first.
Okay.
It's a parent's failure to validate or respond enough to a child's emotional needs. So it might take the form of a child growing up in a household where the parents really don't understand emotion and don't pay attention to it, so that when the child feels something, no one notices. And so this gives the child the message that emotions are unimportant and they don't matter.
Well, you also say the child hides them.
Exactly.
As life goes on.
It's very adaptive, actually. If you grow up in a household where emotions are either ignored or discouraged, children are very adaptive and creative, and what they do is they push their emotions down and away.
They develop an ability to just, but still, as you point out, it's still there and will have its repercussions.
Exactly. I mean, it can get a child through their childhood fine, which is why it's so adaptive, but in adulthood, we really need our emotions. We need them to really thrive and connect and make decisions and be happy in adulthood.
Of course, the thing is with females, and especially females who work, I've just interviewed somebody on that, you always feel guilty. So what is your advice to women? How do they recognize this silent affliction?
Guilt comes up a lot because I think in the book a lot I talk about parents and how, the whole definition is a parent's failure to do something for a child. And really, I think the key is to not feel guilty about it. If you're looking at your own children and thinking, gee, maybe I'm emotionally neglecting them, it's not your fault, just as it wasn't your parents' fault. This is something that just keeps getting passed down. It's very insidious.
And you address this in the book, that indeed how this can happen. What is your advice to professional, people who treat these people like this?
Well, it was interesting when I started to become aware of how powerful this effect is. I started talking to some of my colleagues about it, and they, psychologists' response is, yes, I see this a lot too. But yet, there's been no universal term placed on childhood emotional neglect. If you say that term to a therapist, they get it intuitively, but it's not a known term. So
you've been with your fellow psychologists and you have brought them into this area to make them aware of this, and have they been receiving with this, or are they say no? They never back away from you?
Not so far. It seems like every psychologist or therapist has this concept in the back of their minds when they're practicing, but to just what I'm trying to do is help therapists be more aware.
Which
of
I
it.
thought was terribly important in your book, that you do have this advice. You not only have the advice for parents, to recognize this, but you also have the advice to the professionals. And I wondered how reciprocal they were as to coming. And the acronym, by the way, is CEN, and it has become very accepted.
Yes, it's getting a very good reception so far. I think therapists feel relieved to have a term so that they can, and to be able to see the effects of it and how it's different from childhood abuse or mistreatment of some kind. It really deserves its own category and its own attention, but it's been overlooked.
Before we leave, I have to get back to parents. Having been a parent and felt that I failed here, I was successful there. Would you give some advice before we leave to people, parents, what they should see to recognize? I mean, this thing is such a challenge, being silent, if you would.
It is, yes. My advice to parents is try to focus less on your child's behavior and instead ask yourself, what's driving that behavior? What is my child feeling that is making him or her behave this way? And not only try to identify it, but try to feel what your child is feeling, because that is an incredibly powerful force, empathy, which is really overlooked, I think, in a lot of parenting literature. If you can identify your child's feeling and feel it with them, you can start from there and then start to go to what's causing that feeling, and that's what's going to help change a child's behavior.
Well, and also you could buy her book, Running on Empty. Our guest has been Jonice Webb, psychologist, and she has absolutely jumped over a huge milestone in this and recognizing this. I congratulate you and wish you well. Thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thank you, Smokey.
Thank you for joining us tonight. This has been the Smokey Bacon and Dick Concannon Show.